My name is Olivia Carter, and I want to begin this story with a morning I will never forget. The morning my father threw my suitcase out onto the curb, in front of the neighbors, in front of children walking to school, in front of the entire world as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Less than 24 hours after we buried my grandfather, I stood there on the sidewalk in front of the house I had grown up in for 20 years, watching the suitcase lie on its side against the gray concrete. The lock burst open from the impact, clothes spilling out and mixing with the dead leaves no one had gotten around to sweeping. March mornings in Norfolk are cold and windy, the kind of wind that comes off the water carrying salt and a damp chill that seeps straight into your bones. I was wearing a thin jacket, not dressed warmly enough, because no one had warned me that this morning would require preparation for something like this. My father stood on the front steps, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on me, not with rising anger, not with pain or regret, with the cold efficiency of a man completing a routine administrative task. As though I were a line item on his to-do list, and he had just crossed me off. He said, "I remember every word, I will remember every word until I die," he said. "As of today, you have no place here anymore. You are homeless." Then he turned and went inside, closed the door behind him, and I heard the familiar beep of the security system, a beep I had heard thousands of times over 20 years, but this time it carried a different meaning. The code had been changed. I no longer had access. I am a United States Marine Corps officer. I have been trained to hold my ground under fire, to stay calm in situations that would send ordinary people into panic, to keep my emotions from overriding my judgment in the moments that matter most. I have been through things that, if I described them to you, would keep you awake for several nights. But no training exercise, no tactical manual, no commanding officer had ever prepared me for the feeling of standing on the sidewalk in front of my own home, the home I had grown up in, the home I had believed was mine, and realizing that door would never open for me again. What broke inside my chest in that moment was not loud or violent. It was quiet, like a sheet of paper being torn down the middle in a straight, slow line 1 millimeter at a time. And when it finished breaking, I stood there with whatever remained of myself and wondered if there was enough left to keep going. I picked up the suitcase, stuffed the fallen clothes back inside, stood up, and I walked away. I did not look back. That is how this story begins. But for you to understand why it ended the way it did, I need to tell you everything from the beginning. About my grandfather. About that house. About the man who made me who I am today. Admiral Richard Carter was not the kind of man you would find playing in the backyard with his granddaughter on Sunday afternoons. Not the kind of grandfather who sat through cartoons, hid candy in his desk drawer, or called to ask how school was going. He was tall, straight-backed, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had worn a military uniform for 40 years and could never quite shed the posture even after retiring. His hair had gone white early, around 50, based on the photographs I had seen, and his gray eyes were the kind that I never once saw blink quickly or look away when faced with something uncomfortable. He had served in 3 wars. He had commanded warships across stretches of ocean that never appeared in textbooks. He had stood on the deck through storms that his crew believed would kill them all, and he had kept every one of them alive through calmness and correct decisions made in moments that allowed no margin for error. The display cabinet in his library held more medals than it had room for, and those were only the ones he had accepted. He had refused not a few. But to me, in my memory, he was not the admiral. He was the man who sat across from me in the library on winter evenings and asked me questions that no one else thought to ask a 10-year-old child. I came to live with him when I was 8 years old. My parents, I will say more about them later, were people of large ambitions and small patience. They had married young, had me early, and quickly discovered that the marriage and the child had arrived before they were ready for either. My father was skilled at making money, my mother was skilled at spending it, and both were skilled at convincing themselves that their choices were made in the family's best interest. When they received a major business opportunity in Washington, D.C., they called it the kind of chance that comes once in a lifetime. When they decided to leave me with my grandfather in Norfolk, they called it a more stable environment for the child. When they visited only at Thanksgiving and Christmas, they called it quality over quantity. I grew up and learned that people can put any beautiful name on anything. That does not change what the thing actually is. The reality was, I was 8 years old, I had no parents nearby, And I was living in a very large house with a very stern man whom I did not know how to address except as grandfather, because that was the most obvious thing I could think of. The first weeks were hard. Not because my grandfather treated me badly. He did not. But because he did not know how to handle a frightened, lonely 8-year-old girl. And I did not know how to exist in the space of a man whose entire life had been spent giving orders to sailors, not comforting children. We ate dinner together every evening. That was his unbreakable rule. The table had to have both of us, candles, and proper posture. But those dinners were strangely silent. He ate, I ate. The sound of silverware against porcelain china rang very clearly in the large room. Then came a winter evening. I remember it clearly because it was snowing, light snow drifting past the windows like dust, when I was sitting alone in the library after dinner, not knowing what to do with the long empty hours. I was sitting on the rug with my back against the low bookshelf, looking out the window with the feeling of a child who does not know where she belongs. My grandfather walked in without knocking. He glanced at me on the rug for 1 second, then without a word went straight to the tall bookshelf, pulled out a thick volume and set it down in front of me. Stories of United States Naval History, Volume 1. Then he sat down in the brown leather chair near the window, opened his own book and began to read. We sat like that for 2 hours. Neither of us said a word. Outside the snow fell. Inside it was warm. And I, for the first time since arriving in this house, did not feel alone. I cannot fully explain that. My grandfather did not hug me, did not ask how I was feeling, did not say anything kind. He simply was there. And his presence, that solid, quiet presence that required no confirmation through words, gave me what I needed in that moment more than any words of comfort could have. From that night forward, the library became our space. Not every evening and not on any fixed schedule. But usually after dinner one of us would drift toward the library, and the other would naturally appear before long. We read. And sometimes my grandfather would begin to talk. Not the way ordinary people talk. He did not ask how my day at school had been, whether my friends were kind, whether my teachers were reasonable. He asked entirely different kinds of questions. He asked, Olivia, at the Battle of Midway in 1942, Admiral Nimitz made a decision that many people considered reckless. You've finished reading that section. Do you think he was right or wrong? I was 9 years old and had never been asked for my serious opinion on anything. I remember sitting up straighter, furrowing my brow, and actually thinking before I answered. He listened without interrupting, without smiling condescendingly. Then he said, Your reasoning has 3 strong points and one thing you've overlooked. Would you like to know what it is? I would. I always would. That was how he taught me, not by providing answers but by asking questions that made me find them myself. He taught me that the most intelligent person in a room is not the one who knows the most, but the one who knows how to ask the right questions. He taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is looking directly at what frightens you and deciding to move forward anyway. He taught me that a good leader does not need everyone to like them. A good leader needs everyone to trust them, and to be trusted you must be trustworthy, and to be trustworthy you must be consistent even when no one is watching. When I was 12, I told him I wanted to join the military. He did not cheer or object or sigh with worry. He simply gave one nod and said, Then you need to be better at physical fitness. You're being lazy. I started getting up early to run the next morning. When I was 16 on a winter morning, my grandfather led me down to the shore before daybreak. We stood there looking out at the black water, saying nothing, until the horizon began to lighten to a gray blue. Then he turned to look at me and said, as though continuing a conversation already underway, Olivia, there are 2 things a person can leave behind when they die. Wealth and character. Wealth fades away, spent, given off, divided up until nothing remains. Character lives on in the people you have touched. I said nothing because I did not know what to say. I stood beside him and watched the sun rise. I did not fully understand those words at the time. I would understand them later, and that understanding would come to me in the most painful way I could have imagined. I entered the Naval Academy at 18, then transferred to the Marine Corps after graduation. My grandfather sat in the front row at my commissioning ceremony, straight as a ruler, wearing his full dress uniform even though he had been retired for over a decade. And when they read my name, I saw him nod once from across the room. Just once. A small movement. To him, that was how you said I am proud of you. And I understood it as clearly as if he had shouted it in front of the entire auditorium. My parents did not come. My mother sent a bouquet of flowers and a brief handwritten card. My father called that evening, spoke for about 5 minutes, asked if I was happy, then mentioned a business contract he was tracking before hanging up. I was 22 and had been accustomed to this for a long time, so I did not allow it to affect that evening. My grandfather and I had dinner at a small seafood restaurant near the harbor. He ordered red wine and drank a glass with me, something he rarely did, and we sat talking until nearly 11 o'clock at night. That was one of the best evenings of my life. The years that followed I served. I cannot describe in detail what I did or where I went because most of it remains classified, but I can say that I traveled to places that do not appear on tourist maps. I did things I cannot tell most people about. And through all those years, one thing did not change. I called my grandfather every Sunday. Wherever I was, whatever the time zone, however exhausted I was from the day, I called. And he always answered. Always. We did not say sweet things. He did not ask, "Are you safe?" He asked, "Have you been reading anything good?" I did not tell him about the hard things. I told him about what I had observed, the people I had met, the decisions I had been required to make. And he listened, asked questions, occasionally shared something similar from 30 years back in his own life. Those calls were my anchor. Wherever I was in the world, however chaotic things were around me, I knew that come Sunday I would call my grandfather and everything would feel, for a little while, slightly more like it made sense. Then, the year before he died, the calls began to change. His voice was slower. Not much, just a little, enough for me to notice but not enough for someone unfamiliar with him. He would pause in the middle of sentences, not because he forgot his train of thought but because he was thinking, but the pauses lasted longer than before. Once he called me by my grandmother's name. She had been gone for 20 years, then corrected himself immediately, his voice unchanged, as though it had not happened. I requested leave to visit in November. He looked older. Not dramatically, still straight-backed, still impeccably dressed, but I saw it in how long he gazed out the window, in how he held a book without turning pages. I stayed 2 weeks. Each evening we sat in the library. He told me more than usual, stories from his youth, decisions he had made and decisions he regretted, as though he was trying to transfer something, making sure the things that mattered would not be lost when he was gone. The last week before I returned to base, he took my hand, something he rarely did, and looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You are the finest person I have ever had the privilege of teaching in this life." I could not respond immediately. I looked at him, the gray eyes now surrounded by deep lines, the white hair thinner than it used to be, and felt something in my chest that wanted to break open. "You taught me everything I needed," I said finally. He nodded, released my hand, and looked out the window as he always did. That was the last time I saw my grandfather alert and well. The call came on a Wednesday morning in March. It was not yet 6 o'clock. I was in my room and barely awake when my phone rang. The Norfolk home number. I knew immediately. The caller was Mrs. Hendricks, the woman who had cared for my grandfather and managed the household for the past 3 years. She spoke briefly, the way my grandfather had trained everyone around him to speak. "Mr. Carter passed away at 4:30 this morning. He went in his sleep. No pain." I thanked her, set the phone down, sat on the edge of the bed. In the darkened room, I did nothing for a long while. I simply sat and breathed and let the truth settle in. Not as news but as reality. The fact that the man who had been the center of my world for 20 years was no longer there. That I would never again call on Sunday and hear him pick up. That the library in Norfolk would now be silent in an entirely different way. I sat like that until it was light. Then I stood up, got dressed, and began making arrangements to go home. My parents came too. My father flew from Washington, D.C., my mother from a business trip in Miami. They arrived at the Norfolk house before I did, and when I walked in, I found my father standing in the middle of the living room, looking around with the eyes of someone taking inventory. I said hello. He nodded. My mother came and hugged me. A brief hug, the kind you give at a cocktail party. Then walked over to examine a painting on the wall and asked aloud how much it might be worth. The funeral proceeded exactly as my grandfather had arranged in advance, in an envelope labeled "Funeral Instructions," left in the top drawer of his desk. No pink flowers, no sentimental music. Only the flag, the bugle, and men and women in uniform standing at attention in the cold to see him off. Hundreds of people came. Many I did not know, old comrades of his, young officers he had mentored over decades, staff from the Veterans Fund that bore his name. They stood in rows, and when the flag-draped casket was lowered, many of them, men and women who had been through things I could not imagine, stood at attention and wept without hiding it. I stood in the front row in my own uniform and kept my face composed. Not because I was not in pain, but because I knew my grandfather would want me to stand straight. My father stood beside me, hands in his pockets, and throughout the entire ceremony I noticed that his eyes were not looking down at the casket but toward the estate in the distance, as though he were calculating something in his mind. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered in the office of Attorney James Bennett. I knew this space well. Mr. Bennett had been my grandfather's lawyer since before I was born, and I had come here a few times with my grandfather as a small child. The office was small and warm, smelling of old books and cherry wood, the floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with case files. Mr. Bennett was a slight man of 65, with white hair and round glasses that always sat slightly crooked on the bridge of his nose. He had the careful silence of someone who had heard many secrets and knew how to keep them. We sat down. My father, my mother, and me. Mr. Bennett sat across from us with a thick sheaf of documents on the table before him. He began to read. His voice was measured and slow, one clause at a time, one asset at a time. And as he read, I heard my parents breathe differently. The Norfolk Coastal Estate, approximately 22,000 square feet, estimated market value $4 million, along with all furnishings and fixtures, to William and Margaret Carter. An investment portfolio including blue-chip stocks, government bonds, and money market accounts, estimated total value $8 million, to William and Margaret Carter. Bank accounts, cash holdings, life insurance, to William and Margaret Carter. A new model black Tesla Model S in the garage, to William and Margaret Carter. My mother could barely suppress her smile. My father sat straighter, shoulders opening out, the body language of a man expanding to fill all available space. Then came my portion. Mr. Bennett glanced up at me over his glasses for 1 second before continuing. Olivia Carter receives the silver compass that Admiral Richard Carter carried on all of his naval voyages. The family photograph collection from 1958 to 2005. The oil painting entitled Dawn over the Pacific that hangs in the library. And the complete book collection in the library. That was all. Mr. Bennett set the papers down and looked at us. My father gave one nod. The nod of a man who wants to say, "Fine, that's done, we can leave now." My mother had already taken out her phone, her thumb moving quickly as though she had a waiting to-do list. I looked at the papers on the table, then looked out the window. For one moment I felt something strange, not pain, not anger. Just a quiet recognition that the house I had lived in for 20 years, where the door frame of my bedroom held the pencil marks my grandfather had made every birthday to measure my height, where the low bookshelf in the library was the one I had sat against on the carpet as a frightened, lonely 8-year-old. That house was no longer mine in any legal sense. We left. My parents went in one car, talking to each other about renovation plans and which investments to liquidate first, and who to invite to the celebration dinner. I drove alone and said nothing the entire way back. The morning after, I woke at my usual military time. 6 o'clock, dressed and downstairs in the kitchen. The house in the early morning had a familiar smell, wood and sea and coffee, the smell I had associated with the concept of home since I was 8 years old. I poured a cup, sat at the kitchen table, and for one brief moment, everything felt normal. Then my mother walked in. She saw me sitting there, and instead of saying good morning, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating. She turned back inside and called my father's name. My father appeared 5 minutes later, holding a sheet of paper. I do not know what it said, I never got close enough to read it. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "We need your room for an office. You have 1 hour to collect your things." I set my coffee cup down slowly, looked at him. "Are you serious? This is not your home anymore." His voice was flat, without emotion, like someone reciting the terms of a contract for the 10th time. "It never was. You lived here because my father permitted it. He's gone now. The decisions belong to us." I looked at my mother. She was looking down at her coffee cup. "Mom," I said, She did not look up. I stood, went upstairs, packed my bag in silence. I did not have much here. Most of my things were at base. A few changes of clothes, some books, small personal items. When I came downstairs with the suitcase, my father was standing at the front door. He opened it for me the way you open a door for a delivery person. I stepped out onto the front steps. Then he took the handle of my suitcase, not to carry it for me, and threw it down the steps. The suitcase rolled down 2 stone steps, hit the sidewalk below, and burst open on impact. "Good luck," he said. Then he went inside and closed the door. The beep of the security system. A new code. The door shut with a solid final sound. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at the suitcase lying in front of me. A neighbor's child was standing at the gate next door, maybe 7 years old, watching me with wide, round eyes. I smiled at the child. The child did not smile back. It turned and ran inside calling for its mother. I picked up the suitcase, tucked the clothes back in, stood up, and began to walk. I did not look back at the house. Not once. I stayed in a hotel. Not a fancy one. Somewhere clean and adequate near the base. The room had a bed, a desk, a television I never turned on. The window looked out onto a parking lot. I sat in that room and did not do much for the first 2 days. I did not call anyone because I did not know what to say. "Hello, my parents just threw me out the day after my grandfather's funeral. Do you have any advice?" There is no conversation like that that doesn't require more explanation than I had the energy to give. I thought a great deal. That is what I did in those days, sat and thought, looked out the window, walked around the area near the hotel when I could no longer stay seated. I thought about my grandfather, about everything he had taught me, about the evenings in the library, the early mornings at the shore, the Sunday phone calls across 15 years. I thought about a question I had not yet let myself ask. Did my grandfather know this would happen? Did he know that when he was gone my parents would do what they did? And if he knew, why did he not do something to prevent it? I had no answer at the time. On the morning of the 3rd day, I was eating breakfast at a diner near the base, eggs and toast and coffee, a breakfast I had eaten 100 times in 100 different places over my years of service, when my phone rang. "Miss Olivia Carter?" "Yes. This is James Bennett, your grandfather's attorney. I apologize for calling without warning." I set down my fork. "Yes, Mr. Bennett. What is it? Could you tell me, did your parents ask about the complete will? Did they request it be read from beginning to end?" A strange question. I thought back to that afternoon. "I think you read it all. You read it start to finish in front of us." A small pause on the line. Then Mr. Bennett said in a measured voice, "I read the first page of the will, Miss Olivia." The first page. Admiral Carter's will has 3 pages. That afternoon, after I finished reading page 1, the section listing the assets and beneficiaries, your father stood up and said he believed everything was clear and thanked me for my time. He and your mother left before I could continue. I sat very still. "And you?" he asked. I didn't know there were more pages. I assumed you had finished." "Exactly. And since no one requested that I continue, I did not continue." His voice was careful, each word deliberate. "My professional obligation does not permit me to disclose the contents of a will unless requested, or unless a specific event occurs that creates a duty for me to act." "A specific event," I repeated. "Miss Olivia, I need you to come to my office. Today if you're able." I drove to Mr. Bennett's office in 30 minutes. This time it was just the 2 of us across the oak desk. He placed a set of papers before me, thinner than the stack from before, only 2 sheets, but when I looked down and began reading, I felt the world around me go quiet. Page 2 of the will began with the sentence, "The transfer of assets set forth in page 1 is conditional and takes effect only when all of the following conditions have been met and are continuously maintained." I read slowly, 1 line at a time. I read each clause twice to make certain I understood it correctly. Condition 1. Olivia Carter must be permitted to reside at the Norfolk estate at any time of her choosing, for any duration of her choosing, requiring no justification and no approval from any party, with no time limitations. This right may not be revoked or restricted in any form. Condition 2. Olivia Carter must have equal participation in all significant decisions regarding the estate, including but not limited to its sale, lease, mortgaging, major renovation, or change of use. No such decision takes effect without Olivia Carter's written consent. Condition 3. The Richard Carter Foundation, the veteran support fund established in 1998, must continue operating without interruption, with an operating budget no less than its current level, and may not be dissolved, merged, or have its mission altered without written agreement from the Foundation's advisory board. Then I reached the final paragraph of page 2, and I had to set the paper down for a moment. If any condition set forth above is violated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, the entirety of the assets listed in page 1 shall immediately and automatically transfer to Olivia Carter with full legal ownership. This transfer requires no court order, no further agreement, and cannot be contested or reversed by any party. This is my final, carefully considered, and irrevocable intention. I looked up. Mr. Bennett was looking at me over his glasses. They violated it, I said. They violated Condition 1 within 24 hours of the will taking effect, he said. When they removed your name from the security access list and changed the entry code, that constituted a formal denial of your residential rights. How did you know they had done that? Mr. Bennett opened a drawer and placed an already opened envelope on the table. Admiral Carter contracted with the security company to require that any change to access permissions at the estate be reported to my office within 1 hour. This system has been in place since last year, when Mr. Carter began making preparations. I looked at the envelope. He planned this a long time ago. A very long time ago, Mr. Bennett said quietly. I picked up the papers. Turned to page 3, the final and thinnest page. Page 3 contained the legal procedures for the transfer of assets. A list of required documents, timelines, process. Everything had been prepared in advance, neat and clean, leaving no room for ambiguity or dispute. Typical of Admiral Richard Carter. He left nothing unfinished. Legally, Mr. Bennett said, the entire estate has been yours since the moment they changed the security code. We only need to complete the paperwork. I sat quietly for a long moment. Then I asked, is there anything else? Mr. Bennett looked at me, then opened the drawer once more and removed a thick envelope. My name was written on it in handwriting I recognized immediately. Straight, clear, unhesitating, the handwriting of a man who had been writing orders for decades. Mr. Carter asked me to give you this, said Mr. Bennett, after the event occurred. I did not open the envelope in Mr. Bennett's office. I thanked him, gathered all the documents, and left. I drove to the shore, parked in the small open lot along the road where my grandfather and I used to park on early winter mornings when we came out to watch the sunrise. Turned off the engine. Sat in the car with the envelope in my lap. The sky that day was low and overcast, a leaden gray, the kind of March sky in Norfolk that refuses to tell you whether it will clear or rain. The water below the small rise ahead of me was blue-gray, the swells moderate, wind hissing through the car door seals. I opened the envelope. Inside were 8 sheets of handwritten paper, written on both sides, the script small and orderly. I unfolded them and began to read. Olivia, if you are reading this letter, it means I was right about the things I did not want to be right about. And it means you are in pain. I am sorry for that, though the apologies of the dead carry little weight. I want to explain everything I did and why. You deserve the truth, not the fragments you would have to piece together yourself. First, about your parents. I have known William, your father, since he was a boy, of course. I saw in him things that parents often refuse to see in their children. Not malice. I do not think William is a bad man in any absolute sense. But he is the kind of man who, when given power, uses it first to protect himself and only then considers others. And when under pressure, he will choose the easier path, not the right one. I tried to speak with him many times over many years. There were conversations you were never aware of, late nights in the library, afternoons on the porch. I tried to make him understand that some things matter more than money, that the way people treat each other ultimately matters more than any number in a bank account. Sometimes I thought I had gotten through to him, but a person only truly changes when they themselves want to change. No one can do that for them. About Margaret, your mother, I think she is not unkind, only weak. Weak people tend to follow the strongest person in the room, and when that person makes the wrong choice, the weak one rarely has the courage to say no. I had hoped she would be the one to stop William when he went too far. Evidently, I hoped for the wrong thing. Second, why I did what I did. The will was not meant to punish your parents. I did not write it out of anger. Anger is something the very old have little energy to sustain, and I was too old to be angry about anything. I wrote it because I wanted the truth to come into the open, not for my sake but for yours. You deserve to know who the people you have trusted actually are. You deserve to see it once, clearly and undeniably, rather than spending your life questioning and second-guessing yourself. I also wrote it because I hoped, however slim the hope, that they would not violate it. That when faced with clear conditions they would choose right. I hoped you would never need to read this letter because everything would be fine. But I knew the odds were not good. Third, what I want you to understand about power. In 40 years of service, I watched power do terrible things to good people. Not because power is evil, power is only a tool, but because power reveals. It strips away the layers of politeness and calculation that people construct to conceal themselves, and it shows us what was already there all along. A person of good character given power will use it to help. A person of weak character given power will use it to protect themselves and eliminate what they perceive as threats. That is not a conscious decision. It is a reflex, an instinct, something people have been practicing their entire lives without knowing it. You now have power. You have the legal right to do whatever you wish with that house, that estate, those parents of yours. The law is entirely on your side. And that is exactly the most dangerous moment. I am not telling you to forgive or to forget. I am not in any position to say that. I was not the one thrown out of the house. I am telling you to pay attention. Notice what you feel like doing in the very first moment when you are holding those documents. Then sit down and think carefully before you act. Not because your parents deserve to be treated well, but because you deserve to be the person you want to be. People often say revenge is sweet. I have lived long enough to know that revenge usually leaves behind a bitter aftertaste that no one warns you about in advance. Not because the target suffers, but because the one seeking revenge must carry that fire inside them, must feed it, must think about it, and that fire burns the one who holds it just as surely as it burns the one it is aimed at. Fourth, about the house. I built that house over 40 years, not with bricks and mortar, but with things that cannot be seen. Evenings in the library, early mornings at the shore, conversations with the people who passed through it over the decades. I had my old comrades there when they came home from war and no longer knew who they were. I had young officers there when they needed someone to listen before they made consequential decisions. And I had you there, the frightened, lonely 8-year-old who I did not know how to handle but knew I had to do right by. That house has a soul, Olivia. That soul does not live in the walls or the furniture or the insurance money. It lives in what happened inside those walls over 40 years. And you are the only person I know who will understand that and who will protect it. Finally, about you. You have become the person I hoped you would become. Not because I was a gifted teacher, but because you chose each day to become that person. People tend to give parents and grandparents the credit or the blame for who someone turns out to be, but the truth is that character is something each person builds for themselves through the small choices that no one else sees. You did that. Every day. And I am more proud of that than of any medal I was ever awarded. I love you, Olivia. And I trust you will know what you need to do. Richard Carter, January 2025. I folded the letter, sat in the car, looking at the gray water outside, and allowed myself to cry, for the first time since my grandfather died. Not crying for what I had lost, but for what I had just received, the understanding that this man had truly seen me, had truly known me, and had trusted me enough to leave me not only an estate but the most important test of my life. I cried until there were no more tears. Then I sat quietly and watched the waves move against the shore until the sky began to dim. And in that span of time I thought. Took me 4 days. Each morning I woke with my grandfather's letter on the nightstand. Read it once. Then went for breakfast, went for a walk, sat in the room and thought. I thought about everything I could do. The simplest option. Hand the papers to my parents, tell them to be out in a week, and that would be the end of it. They had done exactly that to me in less than 24 hours. I had perfect legal justification, perfect moral justification, and no one could fault me for it. I sat with that option for a full day. Let myself feel it. Examine what it felt like. Felt satisfying for the first second or two. Then something was wrong. Not guilt, I did not think I would be in the wrong to do it. but a hollowness like wanting something sweet and finding when you've eaten it, that you feel worse rather than better. I thought of my grandfather's words in the letter. People often say revenge is sweet. I have lived long enough to know that revenge usually leaves behind a bitter aftertaste that no one warns you about. The second option: sell everything. Take the money, fund the foundation, and leave. No one lives in that house anymore. Clean and finished. I sat with this option for a day as well. It felt tidy, but it felt cold. And I remembered what my grandfather had written about the soul of the house, about everything that had happened inside those four walls over 40 years. Selling the house would erase all of that. And then a third option began to form in my mind, not all at once. It came in pieces, small ideas at a time, during the hours of walking along the waterfront, during the evening sitting with a cold cup of coffee looking out at the hotel parking lot. The third option was not forgiveness. It was not revenge. It was something else, a way to preserve the soul of the house, to continue my grandfather's work, and at the same time not to become someone I did not want to be. On the morning of the 5th day, I knew what I was going to do. I drove to the estate in the afternoon. From some distance away I could already hear music. The lights in the house were on, cars filling the drive and spilling out onto the street. My parents were hosting a party, not a small dinner but a real party with dozens of guests. I parked a block away and walked. I carried the legal file Mr. Bennett had prepared. I had a spare key, an old key from my grandfather's time, kept in a desk drawer at my base for many years. My parents had forgotten it existed. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The living room was full of people. I recognized a few faces, my parents' friends from Washington, a distant relative I had last seen at someone's wedding years ago, a number of complete strangers. People were holding glasses, talking and laughing, music just loud enough to set a mood. The buffet table was laid with generous food. My mother was standing in the center of the room, a glass of red wine in hand, telling something to the cluster of people around her with the smile she reserved for when she wanted to impress. And of course we'll renovate the entire ground floor. The kitchen is far too small for what we need. My father saw me first. His face moved through 3 stages in less than a second: surprise, confusion, then cold. What are you doing here? The conversation around us faded. People began looking over. I did not rush. I walked to the central coffee table, the glass-top table my grandfather had bought on a trip to Japan in 1985, and set the file down on the surface. I'm here to show my parents some documents relating to my grandfather's will, I said, at a volume that let those nearby hear without my needing to raise my voice. My mother came over, still smiling but with different eyes. She picked up the file. The room went entirely quiet. The music was still playing from the corner but no one was listening to it anymore. I stood and watched my mother's face as she read. Smiling, brow furrowing slightly, the smile gone, her eyes widening, looking up at me, looking back down, looking over at my father. My father snatched the papers from her hands. Read. His face went steadily paler with each line. What is this? He asked, his voice lower than usual. Pages 2 and 3 of my grandfather's will, I said. The pages you left before Mr. Bennett had a chance to read them. Someone set a glass down. A murmur moved through the room like a wave. My father placed the file on the table, looked at me. In his eyes, for the first time in my life, I did not see the familiar coldness or contempt. I saw something that looked like fear. Not fear of me, but fear of what he had just recognized about himself. I'm not here to make a scene, I said. But everyone here is a witness that these documents have been properly served. Mr. Bennett's office will be in contact regarding the paperwork on the next business day. Then I turned and walked out the way I had come in, through the front door, down the walk, not looking back. I did not sleep that night. I drove to the waterfront diner, sat alone in a corner, ate a dinner I was not really hungry for. Then I drove back to the hotel, sat on the bed with my grandfather's letter, and read it for the 15th time. I held in my hands everything I needed to do anything. Complete legal authority. No one could judge me for whichever path I chose. But the question was not what I could do. The question was who I wanted to become. I remembered an evening in the library when I was 14. I had been angry about something. I no longer remember what. Perhaps a classmate had been unfair, or someone had treated me badly. I had told my grandfather, with all the feeling of a 14-year-old, hoping he would agree that I was right and the other person was wrong. He listened, then said, "Do you want my advice?" Yes. Whether the other person was wrong matters less than how you choose to respond. Because your response is what you'll have to live with afterward, not their action. I didn't fully understand at the time. I just felt a little disappointed that he wasn't angry along with me. Now I understood. My parents had made their choice. That choice had revealed something true about them. Not something I had discovered, but something that had always been there, waiting only for the right moment to surface. I could not change it. I could not undo it. But I could choose who I would be in this story. And when I sat in that hotel room at 3 in the morning and asked myself one very simple question, what would my grandfather want me to do? The answer came more clearly than anything else I had thought about in the past 4 days. The next morning I called Mr. Bennett before 8 o'clock. "I need to meet with you today. I have some changes I'd like to discuss regarding how the transfer will be executed." 2 hours later, I sat in his office with a blank sheet of paper in front of me and began to sketch out my plan. Mr. Bennett listened, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a point of legal procedure, not once offering an opinion on my choices. That was something I appreciated about him. He was a lawyer, not a moral counselor, and he understood that distinction. I presented my plan over the course of about an hour. When I finished, Mr. Bennett was quiet for a moment, looking at the notes he had made, then looked up. "This is your decision?" "Yes." "Mr. Carter would be pleased," he said quietly. Then he picked up his pen and got to work. 2 days later, I called my parents to the house that was now legally mine, and asked them to sit down. They arrived in silence, rigid like two people waiting for a court verdict. My father sat up straight, but I could see his hands clenching on his knees. My mother looked down at her own hands. I placed a new set of documents on the table. Not legal papers this time. The plan I had drawn up with Mr. Bennett. "I am not evicting you," I said. My mother looked up. "But there will be changes, and I want you both to understand them clearly before anyone signs anything." I explained each point. My parents would move into the small guest cottage at the western corner of the property, a 2-bedroom wood frame house my grandfather had built in 1990 to accommodate old friends when they came to visit. Spacious enough, comfortable, with its own sitting room and kitchen. Not far, but not the main house. The main estate would be converted into the headquarters and operations center of the Richard Carter Foundation. The majority of the investment portfolio would be transferred into the foundation to fund its operations for at least 30 years. My parents would receive a fixed monthly living allowance, enough to live well, not enough to live extravagantly. If they wished to, they could participate in the foundation's work. No obligation, no conditions attached, but the door would be open if they chose to walk through it. When I finished, my father looked at me for a long moment. Then he spoke in a voice I had never heard from him, the familiar coldness and contempt entirely absent. "Why?" I thought before answering. "Because my grandfather didn't teach me anything else." The next 3 months were busy in ways I had not anticipated. I applied for extended leave from the military. Not a resignation, just a pause to settle family affairs. My superiors understood. They gave me 6 months. I hired an architectural firm that specialized in the restoration of historic buildings, and over several working sessions we planned how to transform the 4-bedroom estate into functional space without destroying its soul. The largest living room became a meeting and conference space, with flexible seating that could be rearranged as needed. My grandfather's library, I would not permit anyone to touch a single book, was kept intact as an open reading and reflection space for anyone who came. 2 of the upstairs bedrooms became working offices. My grandfather's own bedroom, the room he had slept in for 50 years, was converted into a small gallery about his life and his contributions to the Navy. The guest cottages scattered across the property, for small units in all, were renovated into temporary housing for veterans and their families, each unit capable of hosting stays from 1 week to 3 months depending on need. Colonel Morrison, my grandfather's old friend I mentioned earlier, became chairman of the advisory board. He brought 3 others with him, retired senior officers with backgrounds in social service work. We hired a professional executive director to run the day-to-day operations. Throughout all this, my parents lived in the small cottage and were rarely visible. Sometimes I passed my mother in the garden. She watered the flowers with the expression of someone going through emotion without thinking about it. Sometimes I noticed the light on in the little house later than expected in the evenings. I did not seek them out. I did not avoid them. I let everything rest at its natural distance and waited. On the morning of the Richard Carter Foundation Center's inaugural opening, I woke at 5 o'clock, my grandfather's hour. The sky was still dark. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the garden. The pathway lights along the garden walk flickered gently in the wind. In the distance, the sound of the sea was like steady breathing. I drank my coffee and remembered something my grandfather used to say. The early morning belongs to people who will decide how the day goes. Those who sleep until 9 let the day decide for them. The first van arrived at 9:15. I stood on the front steps of the house, the exact spot where 3 months earlier my father had stood when he threw my bag out onto the curb, and watched the van pull up to the gate. From inside stepped a man of about 70. He wore jeans and a blue plaid shirt and a battered naval cap with the U.S. Navy insignia. His left leg was prosthetic, I could tell by the way he walked, one side slightly stiff. He carried a small canvas bag and stood looking at the house with an expression I cannot summarize in a few words. It was the combination of distrust, hope, and the deep weariness of someone who has been through too much. His name was Samuel Reeves. U.S. Navy, 20 years of service, retired as a senior chief petty officer. He had lost his job after a financial crisis that was not entirely his fault. Lost his home. Spent years relying on the goodwill of old friends. Someone had told him about our foundation, and he had called with the hesitance of a man who wasn't entirely sure he was allowed to. I walked down the steps toward him. "Mr. Reeves." He turned. Looked at me. "That's right." I extended my hand. "Welcome to Admiral Carter's home." He looked at my hand, then at the house, then back at me. His eyes reddened slightly at the corners. But he shook my hand and kept himself upright. Admiral Carter was the man I served under from 1978 to 1982. The finest man I ever encountered in uniform. I said nothing. Just nodded and let him inside. From that opening day forward, the Richard Carter Foundation Center operated steadily. In the first 6 months, we hosted nearly 20 veterans and their families through the temporary housing program. The counseling and mental health support sessions we held every Tuesday and Thursday averaged 15 attendees per week. There were afternoons when I sat in my grandfather's library and heard the sound of voices rising from downstairs. Not noise, but the sound of people being present, sharing, finding something they had believed was lost to them permanently. My grandfather would have liked that. Around the 4th month, my father came and knocked on the library door. I was reviewing the file of a newly enrolled veteran. At the knock, I looked up. My father stood in the doorway. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, the first time I had seen him not in business clothes since I was small. He looked different. Not younger. Smaller. In the good sense of that word. As though he had set down something he had been carrying for far too long. "Is there anything I can help with?" he asked. I looked at him. Thought of the morning on the sidewalk. The beep of the security system. My grandfather's letter. "The new enrollment files need to be sorted according to priority criteria," I said. "Could you help with that?" He stepped inside. Sat down in the opposite chair. The visitor's chair in the library. The chair that dozens of people had sat in when they came to the foundation for help. He picked up the first file. Began reading. We worked in silence for 2 hours. No one spoke about what had happened 3 months earlier. No one apologized, no one explained, no one named anything. Just 2 people sitting and working. Sometimes that is all you can do to begin again. 1 year after my grandfather died, I stood on the Norfolk shore in the early morning. The same hour, the same place as the morning when I was 16 and my grandfather talked to me about wealth and character. The sky was not yet fully light. The sea was blue-gray, the swells easy, the wind carrying its familiar salt into my face. The eastern sky was beginning to flush coral and orange at the horizon. The sunrise my grandfather had stood and watched so many times from this same shore. I had the silver compass with me. I stood and watched the sun rise, and I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. Not in the way of accounting or assessment, just letting it appear naturally like frames from a film you have lived through and are now watching from a slight distance. I thought about the morning on the sidewalk with the burst-open suitcase. About Mr. Bennett's office and the 2 unread pages. About my grandfather's letter inside the car parked by the shore. About Samuel Reeves standing before the gate with his small canvas bag and his eyes that could not quite trust. About my father sitting in the library and quietly reading through files. I thought about the question I had asked myself in the hotel room at 3 in the morning. Who do I want to be in this story? And I thought about the answer I had chosen. There is something about compassion that people rarely say aloud. It is not always easy, it does not always feel immediately right, and it is not always met with gratitude. Sometimes you choose compassion and the person you extend it toward does not change, does not notice, is not even grateful. But that is not a reason not to choose it. Because compassion is not for changing other people. It is for living as the person you want to be. My grandfather taught me that over 20 years, not through lectures or memorable speeches, but through how he lived. By being who he was every day whether anyone was watching or not. By making the right choices even when the right choice was harder than the wrong one. By believing that character is the most important thing a person possesses, and that keeping it intact is the most important work of a life. I understand those words from the shore when I was 16 now in a way I could not understand them then. Wealth fades away. Character lives on. My grandfather did not say that to teach me about inheritance or wills. He said it to teach me about choice, that every day in every small and large decision, we are either building or eroding the only thing that truly belongs to us. And that one thing, the character no one can take from you unless you surrender it yourself, was his real legacy. Not the estate. Not the investment portfolio. Not the foundation's name or the medals in the display cabinet. But the thing I am standing here with inside my chest this morning, watching the sun rise over the Norfolk water, feeling, despite everything that happened, that I did not betray what he trusted me with. I stood there until the sun was fully up. Then I held the silver compass in my hand, felt its familiar weight, the thing that had followed my grandfather across so many stretches of ocean and was now in my hands, and turned back toward the house. In the yard there were voices. A group of veterans going through their morning exercise routine according to the schedule. One of the new programs we had started the month before. Small laughter. Counting. Footsteps on the gravel. On the porch of the guest cottage, my father was sitting with his coffee, looking out toward the water, the direction I had just come from. When he saw me walk into the yard, he raised a hand in a small wave, the gesture awkward and uncertain, the gesture of someone who is not yet accustomed to this but is trying. I waved back. Then I walked up the steps. Those same steps, that same door, and went inside. The hallway in the morning smelled of coffee and old wood and a trace of the sea from the open windows. My grandfather's photographs still hung in their exact places. The antique clock on the wall still chimed at the correct hours. I walked down the hall, pushed open the library door and stepped in. The early morning light filtered through the tall windows and fell across the bookshelves, the rug, the desk with its brass lamp and yesterday's unfinished files. I set the silver compass on the desk in the spot where it rested each day, sat down in my grandfather's chair, and began a new day. My name is Olivia Carter. My grandfather was Admiral Richard Carter, a man who served this country through 3 wars, lived to the age of 92 with a clear conscience, and left me something more valuable than any estate. He left me a test. And he trusted me enough not to give me the answers in advance. I do not know whether I passed that test. I do not know whether what I chose was right in any absolute sense. I am not certain anything is right in an absolute sense in situations like this one. But I know that when I look back at my decision, I can sleep. I know that each morning when I walk into my grandfather's library and sit down in his chair, I feel that I belong there. And I know that this house, the house with a soul that he built over 40 years, is still living in the way he lived. That is all I could do. And I hope it is enough. Power reveals character. My grandfather taught me that not through words, but by designing a situation in which I would have to demonstrate my own character, to him, to myself, and to what he trusted me to carry forward. I do not know whether I did it right, but I tried, and each day I will keep trying. That is the only thing any of us can do.